Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the complete works of Plato, translated by Jowett. We're going to look at the final section of the Protagoras, pages 344 to 368. It's going to be the fourth, fifth, and sixth exchange of dialogue. And it will conclude the second half of the original text. Let's go to block 1 and take a look at the fourth dialogue on how aesthetics must accompany speculative reason. Protagoras introduces the poem by Simonides, who said two conflicting statements. A man can become truly good, and then hardly can a man be good. Being and becoming must be distinguished to make sense of this contradiction. But the conclusive result is virtue takes a great deal of trouble to acquire. Then we get Socrates interpreting the poet Simonides. Fundamentally, we must first affirm the first principle to know thyself. Socrates always begins with know thyself. He intentionally desired the comparison because he begins, on the one hand, to become good is hard and truly must be linked with good. Therefore, it is hard to become truly good. The intent of the poem, although there is difficulty in becoming good, it is a possibility for a time. Because man is always open to being overcome by circumstance. Therefore, to be good is an impossibility possessed only by God, says Socrates. So that's the conflict. To actually be good is an impossibility. Only God is good. Sounds very similar to the words of Christ. All right, block 2, the fifth exchange of dialectic on knowledge. Knowledge plays a very significant role in this lesson. So this block 2, as a pivot moment, is critically important because it's the dialectic on knowledge. Protagoras. The individual virtues are similar, but possessing knowledge gives one confidence. And this courage comes from a healthy state of the soul. Knowledge is the highest of the attributes to attain. Socrates. If a man knows justice, I find no fault in him. In fact, even at a moderate or intermediate state, I still find no fault in him. To be moderately just is good. It's good enough. And love and approval toward another is to be sought for and acquired. But these truths must be acquired through rational dialogue, not aesthetics and poetry. So here you go. Here's Socrates interjecting the priority of philosophy. Truth is acquired through rational dialogue, not aesthetics, not poetry, because they have diverse interpretations. But then Socrates concludes with, dialogue and communion refine our dokeo suppositions so we can raise them to aletheia truth, especially for virtue. So there's a necessity for dialogue for Socrates in order to take each person's suppositions and then through dialogue to raise them to concept, to raise them to aletheia truth. Especially for virtue. Through dialogue we acquire that common nature of the virtues which we seek. Always guarding against the intrusion of being overcome by sensate pleasure. So the pivot moment of block 2 teaches us that there's a dokeo threshold for Socrates. There's a dokeo threshold of dialogue through which our suppositions pass in order to raise them to becoming conceptual, rational truth. So even though we might have an intuitive type of supposition concerning the truth, to refine it into actual conceptual truth, we must pass through dialogue. We must pass through dialectic. And we know that Socrates does stand for dialectic. And especially when discussing virtue. So let's move on to block 3 in the 6th exchange of dialectic, because now we find the pages dedicated solely to Socrates, who will close out the argument. Pleasure and pain are measured according to excess or defect. Therefore, the art of measuring becomes our principle of life. The art of measuring. Now, what else could we call that? We could call it spiritual discernment. We could. So the art of measuring, or spiritual discernment, becomes the principle of life for Socrates. The art of measuring. Appearance is an art of deception because it leads to wandering choices. To live according to surface appearance is wrong. It is deceptive. It's not the true. It leads us away from the soul resting in truth. Therefore, measurement and appearance are in tension within the self. We always have that competitive outlook. We're not supposed to just take surface finite reality as the truth. There's a deeper truth behind the veil of appearance. And I think that Socrates is exactly right there. Now, therefore, measurement and appearance are in tension within the self. And here he goes. The knowledge of measuring becomes an important first principle concerning the good. The knowledge of measuring is to be sought for and prioritized within the self. We should develop that attribute of the knowledge of measuring. Spiritual discernment, the knowledge of measuring. So block 3, note 3, knowledge of measuring is both rational science and aesthetic art. Knowledge of measuring is rational science and art both. Knowledge has to be prioritized, says Socrates. A defect in measuring is ignorance. It's a want of self-control. Therefore, honorable action is that which is equal to the good. But this knowledge of measuring, the knowledge of measuring must be prioritized. It is the most significant first principle. And we're talking about functioning as science and functioning as art together. Now, 3:4 closes out this dialogue. Protagoras concedes in the end. If knowledge is prioritized, then virtue can be taught. That is, and we can't argue with that. And Socrates cannot argue with it either. But then he concludes, but Socrates, I applaud your argument. So even though the tension still remains, the tension never does get fully resolved about the question, can virtue be taught? Because we don't deny what Protagoras is saying here, because Socrates certainly did prioritize the knowledge of measuring. He prioritized spiritual discernment. Now, if he prioritized spiritual discernment and knowledge of measuring, then knowledge is something that is taught. And so you can't just form an axiomatic truth and say that virtue cannot be taught, because in this respect, there is an aspect of virtue that can be taught, and that aspect is the knowledge of measuring. The knowledge of measuring is something that can be taught and can be dialectically appropriated within the self through the dialectic of praxis, action, and reflection, and that dialectic of action and reflection, and especially that dokeo threshold of dialogue, all functions to refine within the self the knowledge of measuring. It's very important to have that dialectical, what we would call the dokeo threshold, because we begin with what? Appearance. And with appearance we form what? Intuitive suppositions. We don't just initially grasp truth, we form intuitive suppositions. But how do you raise an intuitive supposition to the level of conceptual aletheia truth? Well, Socrates has said over and over and over again in all of these lessons, it's through dialogue, dialectical exchange. And in this case, it's between Protagoras and Socrates and their very in-depth discussion of virtue. And it concludes by bringing everything into concrete focus with the knowledge of measuring. The knowledge of measuring virtue. And if that's to be prioritized, Protagoras is not wrong in saying that, well, something must be able to be taught then. We can't just say virtue cannot be taught, because something can be taught. There can be some teaching concerning knowledge. And so the conclusion to this dialogue, I think, even though the praise is given to Socrates, I think the praise has to be given to Socrates and Protagoras both, because we're still left with a little bit of ambiguity. We're still left with a tension. Can virtue be taught? No. Can virtue be taught? Yes. And we're left in that tension while still hearing the voice of Protagoras say, I applaud your argument, Socrates. Very significant teaching, I think, that I like the idea of this knowledge of measuring being considered a science of philosophy and an art in the realm of aesthetic reflection. Both sides. Remember, to me, because I've always studied Hegel a great deal during my life, that Hegel never could conclude his teaching on absolute spirit with the concept of absolute spirit. Then came the moment of counterblow, where the self is driven back into aesthetics, because there's always something to truth, to spiritual truth, that is beyond concept. Yes, we express it conceptually, but yes, there's something there that is that which surpasses concept, the element of transcendence within truth. There's an element of transcendence that is beyond concept. And Socrates, Plato through Socrates, is leaving us kind of in a area of some ambiguity at the end of this dialogue, because we bring it down to the final concretion of the knowledge of measuring, which needs to be prioritized as a first principle, as a principle of life. Actually, as a principle of life. If that's true for Socrates, then Protagoras is correct in saying, well, if you're going to focus everything down to knowledge, then we do have to say that yes, some aspect of virtue can be taught. Some aspect of virtue can be taught. Beautiful lesson. I'm really impressed with this lesson. That's going to wrap up the Protagoras We had an introduction and then 2 lessons on the original document. Excellent material. That wraps up 344 to 368.